share this. And just a little bit about my background. I grew up in California. I've lived in San Francisco for the last 35 years. Fifth generation Californian, and retired civil engineer turned kind of historic researcher. That was kind of my next interest in life. And there's a long list of projects. And this was one that was actually kind of on the fringe. It was like, I was interested in one of the characters I'll introduce you to, a naval officer named Sonny Woodworth. But I didn't know a whole lot about the shark until I started studying his life and realized that he had an involvement with the shark towards the end of the shark's career. So without further ado, on with the show. So every story has a cast of characters, and you have to whittle it down because there's usually a lot more than you can handle in one 45-minute presentation. So the cast today is two naval officers. There's this gentleman, Lieutenant Allison. That's Celine Woodworth over on that side with the thick black beard. A ship, which is the USS Shark, and carronade, which you see out here in the museum, and a grizzly bear. So just everybody's probably familiar with this area, and this is an aerial photograph taken obviously after they built the South Jetty, the bar and the mouth of the Columbia River. Then closer to home, Cannon Beach and beautiful Haystack Rock. And the carronade, which is out here, had about a 5 3/4 inch diameter bore to it, and it was capable of firing a 24-pound cannonball. It was a smooth bore, short cannon, but very effective. Now, the other part of this story is a letter that I came across that was written in 1847 on March 26th, and it lay hidden pretty much until 1997. So for a long time, there was a letter sitting in a trunk in an attic. Like, that seems like a good setup for some kind of murder mystery. But it pertained to the shark because it was written by a sea captain that saw firsthand what happened to the shark that day. And it starts out, "My dear father." And we'll get to the contents of the letter later in my presentation. So a little historic context. Back in 1820 and 21, the United States Navy was growing, and they commissioned 5 new schooners to be built. Congress allocated $60,000 on May 15th, 1820 for the 5 schooners that were going to be called the Porpoise, the Alligator, the Dolphin, the Shark, and the Grampus. So here they all are. The Alligator was launched first on November 11th, 1820, followed by the Porpoise, and then the Shark, then the Dolphin, and then the Grampus. Now, there were 2 people that were given kind of credit for being the naval architects, Henry Steers and Henry Eckford. I know that Henry Eckford definitely designed the Grampus because they wrote about it in the newspapers, and he was a very famous naval architect and known for designing really fast ships. Henry Steers was a carpenter as well as being a naval architect, and they both probably had a hand in the design of these schooners. But the guy who got the contract to actually build 2 of them, which was the Shark and the Grampus, was James William Doty. And he was the naval constructor, they called him, the general contractor in charge of the Washington, D.C. Naval Yard. And this is kind of what a shipyard looked like in the mid-1800s and the early 1800s. And having an engineering background, I wanted to put things into an Excel spreadsheet. How similar are these ships? Are they really? And really, alligator, porpoise, shark, and dolphin, very similar. They're all about 86 feet long, 24'7" wide, 10'4" deep. The Grampus is a little different. It was 97 feet long, 23'6" wide, and 9'6" deep. But they're all considered probably of the same architects, naval architects. And when you apply those dimensions to the actual drawings, this is kind of how they would apply 86 feet from end to end, beam being 24'7", and then 10'4" deep. Now the Shark was kind of a special ship, and she was assigned the first commander was none other than Matthew Culbreth Perry, and he was a naval officer with an amazing career as it unfolded. But the Shark, after it was launched, it sailed from Washington, D.C. up to New York, and it was written about in the newspapers. It said, "The new, elegant, and warlike-looking United States schooner Shark, Lieutenant Perry, arrived at this port yesterday from Washington. She is an uncommon fast sailor and beat up the East River yesterday in fine style against the wind and tide. Great accolades and great launch to a new schooner." And her first assignment was to go to the coast of Africa. And her mission was basically the suppression of piracy and the slave trade. And during that first year, she was really busy. In this newspaper article from 1822, it said, she has been under sail for 236 days, during which time she boarded 166 vessels, gave convoy 30, assisted 6 in actual distress, and captured several pirates.
Nice.
And then, just as importantly, she has not lost a man since she was put into commission. Being a sailor on a ship was dangerous work back then, and things happened, but they didn't lose a man. Now, Perry went on to have this amazing career, which most of us learned about at some point, and that was in 1852-54, when he was given not only a naval but a diplomatic assignment to make contact with Japan and open up trade and diplomatic relations. And it was depicted by the Japanese in these pieces of artwork. He arrived on the Susquehanna and the USS Mississippi in Edo Bay in July 8th, 1853. They weren't initially open to having these foreigners come onto their land, but when they arrived on these big ships, which they were called the Black Ships by the Japanese, with all their armaments, the Japanese thought, well, we better let them come on land. So now one of the other ships that I wanted just to mention, a sister ship out of the 5, was the USS Dolphin. It was given a different first assignment, and that was basically to go to the west coast of South America. And she was assigned to accompany the USS Franklin, which was a frigate and a ship of the line with 74 cannons. It was one of the largest naval ships at that time. And so they left for the Pacific from the East Coast on October 18, 1821. And over the years in the newspapers, they always listed what ships were in the US Navy. And in 1827, there's the Franklin still in service, and then the Dolphin, the Shark, the Porpoise, and the Grampus are still in use. So just a quick overview of the USS Shark's history. It was launched May 17th, 1821 in Washington, D.C., served off the coast of Africa, and then went to the West Indies, and then up to the New England coast, back to Africa, then to the Mediterranean squadron. By 1838, it needed some serious repairs and servicing, so it came back to Norfolk, Virginia. And then, as soon as it's ready to go, it has a new commander, Lieutenant Abraham Bigelow, and said, your new assignment is go join the Pacific Squadron. And so they leave in the summer of 1839, and they make their way down to the tip of South America for the first time. And it's a really difficult crossing. It was written about in the newspapers. It took them a month just to get around the tip of South America, but they made it. And then the Shark served on the Pacific Squadron for the rest of its career, pretty much. But every 2 years or so, it got a new commander. And so after Bigelow, it was Lieutenant Thomas Aloysius Dornan, and then following Dornan was Lieutenant Henry Eagle, and finally in 1844, May 12th, Lieutenant Neil McCool Howison becomes the next commander of the Shark. Well, historical context and background. So when you're navigating around the globe on these ships, you need maps and charts. And so the chart that Howison was given to come to Oregon was one that was generated in 1841 by this naval officer, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, and he was in charge of what was called the American or the U.S. Exploratory Expedition. And it was the first time the U.S. Navy had embarked on an exploratory expedition to go to the Pacific and basically see what's there and map it all out so that we could navigate. And so they, in 1841, came to Cape Disappointment. They were going to go up the Columbia River. And so they mapped everything, did soundings of what it looked like in 1841 in July. Unfortunately, one of their ships, the USS Peacock, which was sent in, the first one to go in, and they said, sail into Baker Bay. Well, they never made it. They wrecked on what became known as Peacock Spit on the north side of the entrance into the Columbia River. So it was well documented where the wreck occurred and where all these numbers are soundings for how deep the water was then. And that's approximately where it would occur on that aerial photograph. Got stuck on the 17th, and it took a couple of days for it to finally break up. Now, since it was an exploratory expedition, they had naturalists on board as well as artists. And so, well, they drew pictures of the destruction of their ship. And so, day by day, it gets smaller and smaller. And then they all fortunately survive. All the officers and crew get off on their smaller boats, and they paddle into Baker's Bay. And one fellow, Lieutenant Henry L., decided to do a sketch of what it looked like in Baker's Bay, and they met some of the local indigenous peoples with their canoes. So this brings us to one of our main characters, Lieutenant Neil McCool Howison. He was the commander of the Shark starting on May 12th, 1844. This is what he looked like. Brief overview of his life. He was born in 1805 in Virginia, and he must have joined the Navy at a very young age because he became appointed midshipman February 1st, 1823. He became a commissioned lieutenant in the Navy July 15th, 1832. And then he serves on several ships, including the USS Grampus, which was one of the sister ships of the Shark. But by 1843, he's been assigned to the Pensacola Navy Yard in Florida. And so it's a land kind of assignment. And he really wants to come and join the Pacific Squadron. So he applies, and they finally said, okay, we'll send you to the Pacific. We don't have a ship for you to be assigned to yet, but you can go out. And so he sailed on the USS Vandalia with Commodore Alexander S. Dallas, who was going to be the new Commodore of the Pacific Fleet. And they both sailed on May 11th, 1843, and they go to Panama, and they're going down around South America. And they eventually encountered the USS Erie, which was a supply ship at that point. And so the Commodore decides that's going to be my ship. So he moves his pennant from the Vandalia to the Erie, and he brings along Lieutenant Howison to be a lieutenant on his staff of officers. That's great. Finally got an assignment. And so Howison serves on the Erie for the next year or so until 1844, May 12th. They said, okay, you can have your own ship finally, which is always kind of the ultimate goal for a lot of the naval officers. They want to be in command of their own ship rather than just being another officer on the ship. And so he gets to be commander of the USS Shark when it's in Panama. And this is kind of what Panama would have looked like back then based on some renderings. And then he's sailing up and down the coast of South America, Central America, and Mexico, looking after U.S. interests. But in 1846, he's in Mazatlan. And these are some images of what Mazatlan looked like in the 1840s. It was a Mexican seaport where they could resupply. And he's got his own contingent of officers and crew, which there would have been about 70 of them. And I've been able to identify about 20 of them. And so this is how the Shark was depicted in a beautiful painting as a schooner. And so he gets marching orders in April from Commodore Sloat at that time, who was in command of the Pacific Squadron, his orders came from Washington. And he was told, we want you to go to Hawaii, get your ship repaired, and then sail up to Oregon. And we want you to assess the situation up there. Because there were two big events unfolding in the United States back then. One was they were trying to negotiate the boundary between what would be British Canada and the United States. And so both were kind of vying for territory. And then there was a brewing war between Mexico and the United States about where the borders were going to be on the southern part of the United States. And so they sailed for Honolulu and arrived on April 23rd, 1846. Beautiful tropical island. This is what the harbor would have looked like back then. And this was a great image I came across because it shows the ship with its sails up, but just as importantly, behind it, there's a ship that looks like it has listed to one side badly. But basically, I guess they're doing maintenance on that ship because one of the things that Howison writes about in his reports was that, wow, we really had to do a lot of repairs on the Shark, including the hull, and then we had to recopper the entire hull of the ship. And this is kind of how they could do it. I mean, when you've got a ship that's already completed, and they were in Hawaii for 2 months doing repairs. And at that time, he sailed after he got his marching orders or sailing orders with one map of the Oregon coast and the Columbia River, which was generated by Charles Wilkes back in 1841. And it wasn't an actual map, it was a tracing. It's like when you take a piece of tracing paper, you put it over and let's pick the important stuff and hope that that's enough information. And so he was very fortunate because Hawaii back then was a real hub for all the sailing ships that crossed the Pacific because it was a place where they could resupply and do repairs to their ship. And he met several sea captains that were familiar with the Columbia River and the Columbia Bar. There was Andrew Cook Mott, who was a captain of the Hudson Bay Company, Vancouver. and then two American captains, Jotham Sewell Parsons, he was the captain of the American bark Mariposa, and then Captain Nathaniel Crosby, who was captain of the Toulon. And so on June 23rd, after 2 months of hanging out in Hawaii and get their ship repaired and resting up and getting a full complement of crew, they set sail for Oregon. It's a 22-day journey. They arrive on July 15th. They end up kind of making land north of the Columbia River and then sail down to the mouth of the Columbia River or the bar on July 18th. The Shark at sea, action shot. And so they drop anchor on the 18th, according to Allison's account, at 10 a.m. in the morning, and then they send a small boat in to do soundings because they want to check out where's the channel. We've been told that our map is out of date, and so we shouldn't rely on that, but we should basically sound out the channel, and if we can find a pilot who's really familiar with the current conditions, hire them. Well, they couldn't get a pilot, so they did their own sounding, and they sailed in, arrived at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and a smaller boat pulls up, and there's 3 men in the boat. This is a real story. Mr. Lovejoy, mayor of Oregon City, Mr. Spalding, a missionary, and Mr. Gray, resident of Flat Top Plains. And so they arrive, and they'd seen the Shark coming in, and they boarded, and they said, "Glad you made it over the bar. That's a big accomplishment. But from here on, you should really get a pilot. And we wish there were a pilot available to take you upriver, but there isn't. They're all busy right now. But we know this one fellow. His name's James D. Sauls. He was formerly a crew member of the USS Peacock, the one that wrecked in 1841. Peacock spit, and James D. Sauls claims he's a river pilot. He was actually a cook. He actually joined the USS Peacock down in Peru and Palau, where they needed a new cook for their ship, and they hired him. And so he served until the Peacock wrecked, and then it's unclear whether he, after the Peacock wreck, whether he deserted or just there was no more ship, and so he stayed behind. But he volunteered for this, and these 3 gentlemen kind of vouched for him, and Neil Howison, not knowing any better, said, "Sure, I'll turn over navigational control of the ship to Mr. Sauls." 20 minutes later, they're stuck on a sandbar on a shoal. It was a short piloting. And so they're stuck there until 10 p.m. Meantime, they get another pilot who's more experienced, named Alexander Latty, who worked for the Hudson Bay Company. He came down from Astoria. They got free sail up to Astoria, and it was like, we made it this far. That's the first leg of this journey up the Columbia. And they're in Astoria until July 22nd. And then they set sail for Fort Vancouver. But many of you probably have seen these images of Fort George, but it just gives you kind of a sense of what it was like when they arrived. This was a rendering that was done by Charles Wilkes in 1841. This was Thomas Jefferson Farnham, who was another traveler, journalist who came and visited in the early 1840s. And then this was a watercolor. And then this was a sketch that was actually produced by one of the former crew members of the Shark, Earl Osborne. But he did it many, many decades later. It was kind of part of his memoirs and writing about what happened when they were shipwrecked. And so there's that. And so the Shark, their destination is Fort Vancouver. And so they're going to have to sail about 100 miles up the Columbia River. So they're able to get a new pilot, somebody who everybody knew was experienced and they could rely on. And his name was George. And he was probably of mixed ancestry, British, and then a indigenous woman was his mother, most likely a Chinook woman. And he had a brother named Ramsey, and they were both river pilots, and they competed with one another. And so on July 22nd, the Shark set sail with their pilot George up the Columbia River, and they arrive on the evening of the 24th. And so Neil Howison writes about this. And when they got there, they found that there was Her British Majesty sloop of war Modeste, because the British were concerned about this boundary issue. And so we want to have a show of force. And so they sent one of their naval ships. You know, it's a Captain Bailey who was in command, but as far as I know, there's no relation to my family. But he immediately sent on board his compliments and offered services. Amongst naval officers and crew, there's usually a lot of camaraderie, regardless of which nation you were from, because they knew there would always come a point when you needed each other's help. And there were also moored to the riverbank 2 barks and a ship in the employment of the Hudson's Bay Company. There are actually 2 of those for Hudson Bay Company barks, the Columbia and the Vancouver. And this is some renderings of what Fort Vancouver looked like back in the 1840s. It was kind of a bucolic looking place, and there's the Columbia River with a ship anchored out there. So back in 1846, how many bar and river pilots actually were there that they could call upon to assist them to make this perilous journey? And I found there were 12. I don't know if all 12 were actual river pilots. They claimed to be, but Mr. Alexander Laddie, he was a mate on the Cadboro, which was one of the Hudson Bay companies, and he was experienced and he was reliable. James Sangster, he was a mate on the Cowlitz, another Hudson Bay Company ship. Nathaniel Crosby, who we met a little earlier, American bark Toulon's captain, and then Andrew Cook Mott, another Hudson's Bay Company bark Vancouver captain, and these 2 Native American brothers, George and Ramsey, and then a fellow who was another cook that was up at Fort Vancouver who claimed to be a pilot named George Washington, and then Captain Joseph Sewell Parsons of the Mariposa, James Burney of the Hudson Bay Company, James Sauls, who knows whether maybe he was having a bad day, but he was of the USS Peacock, claimed to be a pilot, and then Captain Josiah Spaulding of the ship Luzon and Captain James Scarborough of the bark Cadboro, which we'll learn more about in a little bit. Nathaniel Crosby was very experienced, and it's a little trivia. He was the great grandfather of Bing Crosby, and so he had an amazing career and was well respected. And interestingly enough, at the end of his career, his life ended in Hong Kong. He got sick there and died, where he ended up being buried. And so we know what the 2 brothers, Ramsey and George, looked like because Charles Wilkes actually drew their images and published it in his report at the end of getting back from the exploratory expedition. So Howison had orders that by September 1st, we want you out of the Columbia River and headed down to San Francisco. And so on August 23rd, having completed their mission to investigate Oregon, gather as much information about the political situation and the people here, how many American immigrants are there versus how many British immigrants, and what are their sentiments? Who are they loyal to? Americans or the British, or are they just independent? But they depart on August 23rd, and they set sail with 2 other ships were going down the river at that time, the Mariposa and the Toulon. And so only one of the ships had a pilot, though, and it was actually the Toulon, the first one that went down there. And the Shark, as it's going down, after, according to Neil Howison's report, he was kind of like complaining a little bit. He says the American bark Toulon, bound to the Sandwich Islands and now attempting to go down the river, had required the services of the old Indian, which would have been either George or Ramsey, who acted as pilot, which left me entirely dependent on the lead and a boat ahead. That was the Mariposa, the boat ahead. They didn't have a pilot, so they had to basically hope that they could follow these other 2 boats. And it was a 100-mile journey, but 4 miles down, they encountered the Toulon, the one with the pilot, that's running around, stuck on a bar. And immediately they basically change plans, and they come over and they tie off to the Toulon, and they help them to basically unload their cargo so they can lighten the ship, they can float off the bar. It was a 3-day kind of delay to getting down to the Baker's Bay, which they finally got there on the 8th of September. Now we're getting back to the other member of the cast, Salim E. Woodworth, naval officer. He was a past midshipman at this point in his career, and he was born in New York City. He was the son of Samuel Woodworth, who was a well-known kind of playwright, journalist, bon vivant, who had a lot of kids, and he's named his second son Salim. And I think it was after there was a very popular Broadway play, one of the main characters was named Salim. But then there were also some Turkish sultans named Salim as well. That was his name. And he suffered from wanderlust from an early age. At age 12, he and a buddy in New York City said, "We're running away from home because we want to walk across the United States to the Pacific." They got as far as upstate New York when the parents caught up to him and brought them back and said, "You're not old enough yet, you have to wait." So he waited until he was 19, and then he had an opportunity to go on a merchant ship to the Pacific Ocean. It was called the Margaret Oakley. And the Margaret Oakley's mission was not only to do trade, but earlier on a prior mission to the Pacific, they had actually picked up 2 Pacific Islanders just in skirmishes. And so they brought them back to New York City where they lived for a couple of years and were kind of put on display, but they always were promised that we'll take you back home. Only one of them lived long enough to go back to the Pacific. And so when the Margaret Oakley sailed back to the Pacific to return, his name was Draco, to his island, Salim went on that ship and became good friends with Draco, learned his language as well as other languages. And he was away for 4 years. And there was very limited contact back then between, if you're out on a ship on the Pacific, sending a letter home was like, oh, this could take a year or 2. So his parents didn't hear from him for a couple of years. And finally, he showed up one summer afternoon and he's like, I'm back. And he had been shipwrecked eventually off the coast of Africa and then finally made his way home. So he had all these amazing adventures. And then his father says, that's great that you're home, but now you got to get a job. Where have you heard that before? And so he said, do you like being on ships? You know, from the sea, why don't you join the Navy? And so he did. And so he was assigned to various ships and served in the Mediterranean. And then in 1844, he was assigned to the USS Truxton, and they were sent to the coast of Africa to basically do suppression of piracy and the slave trade. But it was a tough assignment because the sailors that went on those ships off of Africa were subjected to a lot of the tropical diseases, and they oftentimes got sick. And the Truxton became known as kind of a sick ship. And they made their way back to the United States in November 1845. Salim was ill and needed time to recover. But after a couple months, this old dream of his resurfaced somehow, and he put in a request to the Navy Department, say, I think I can deliver naval orders for the Pacific Squadron faster if I go overland on that Oregon Trail that's become so popular that if you were to put them on a ship and sail them around the tip of South America. And the Navy Department says, okay, and on March 25th, he's gotten his commission granted and he's off with naval orders to start on the Oregon Trail. He makes his way to Independence, Missouri, where the wagon trains would assemble and then make their way across the United States. And it was a couple-month-long journey. And so he started out in a wagon train, had a wagon and a couple friends, and they were making their way. But it was just like traffic jam and very slow. And Salim had said at the beginning of this journey, I'm going to set a new speed record. And this wagon train thing was just not working out. Even though it was like, oxen pulling wagons are very reliable, but they were very slow. And so when they got to Independence Rock in Wyoming, Salim and his traveling companion said, we're selling the wagon. We're going to give our belongings that we don't need away or sell them. And then we're going to get pack mules and horses, which they did. And so they finally arrived in Oregon City on August 19th, 1846. And it was like 3 days before the Shark was due to set sail, go down the Columbia River. Now, just to give everybody a sense of what Oregon City was like back in 1846, it was described in a newspaper article that was published in Honolulu. It says Oregon City, it's like population of 500 with 80 houses, 2 churches, 2 taverns, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 cooper shops, 2 cabinet shops, 4 tailor shops, 1 hatter's, 1 tannery, 3 shoe shops, 2 silversmiths, 4 stores, 2 flour, 2 sawmills, and a lathe machine. It was kind of a booming frontier town. It was like bustling. And so Salim makes contact with the Shark. They invite him on board, naval hospitality, and they said, sail with us to San Francisco. And Salim says, I'll sail with you as far as Baker's Bay, but then I'm going to go and do my overland trek down to San Francisco. That's part of my dream. And so he wrote about this in an article that was published in the Home Journal. He says, after spending several days pleasantly aboard the Shark, I left her ready to put to sea and started for Oregon City, where I commenced making preparations for an overland journey to this place, Yerba Buena. That's what San Francisco was called back then, but found it a difficult matter to raise a party strong enough to pass with safety through the intervening Indian country. You needed a large party back then to basically strengthen numbers to make your way through Southern Oregon and Northern California. And so, unfortunately, 2 days later, the Shark wrecks on what were called the South Breakers. And this is approximately the location where the shark wrecked. And this would have been where it would be located on the Wilkes map. Just, probably what it looked like initially. Fortunately, like the USS Peacock, all the officers and crew were able to evacuate from the ship, get on their smaller boats and paddle their way up to Point Adams and then make their way to Port Astoria. Howison wrote about his version of exactly what happened that day in a letter on September 15th, which got published shortly thereafter. And then during the course of the following year, it was being published in newspapers all over the United States as it's made its way east. Now, one of the other people who wrote about this, remember I said there were 3 ships going down the river that day, the Shark, the Mariposa, and the Toulon. The Toulon and the Mariposa made it to Honolulu. And the ship that went out right before the Shark attempted to go out was the Mariposa, and that was Captain Parsons. And he writes in an article, at 5:30 p.m. I broke ground. Wind light at the time at 6 past the schooner Shark, bearing southeast by east per compass on shore on the south breakers. My pilot would not bring the ship to an anchor for fear that we might be lost. At 7:30 they passed the bar. Shark fired minute guns all night, and I answered from my ship. So right after getting across the bar, they heard the Shark firing its distress signals, which were the minute guns, saying, "We need help." And so they dropped anchor, but they had to wait till the next morning to send a small boat in to basically offer assistance and see if there's anybody to rescue, which they did. Now, Howison had to write a long report about the wreck of the Shark because he was in command of the Shark and it was his responsibility to explain exactly what happened. So he wrote a very long report, which you can look up online and read. The other thing I mentioned was this letter that was stuck in an attic trunk until 1997 when it was discovered by a descendant of Captain Parsons, who read the letter, realized what she had in her hands and said, "This is remarkable. This adds a whole new kind of like bit of information that hadn't been previously published about what happened on September 10th to the Shark." And as I mentioned, it was written on March 26, 1847, that Mariposa went from the Columbia River to Honolulu, then to China, and then it was on its way back to New York City, and they were crossing the Indian Ocean. And Parsons sits down and decides, "I'm going to write my dad and tell him what I've been doing for the last couple months or years." And so in this letter, I just kind of highlighted some of the really important information. He said, "Captain Neil Howison of the United States schooner Shark came down the day after Crosby left, having on board Mr. Alexander Latty, who was the pilot who helped him come in from being stuck on Chinook Shoal to Port Astoria. He brought the schooner from Fort George to Baker's Bay. Captain Howison felt so confident that he could take his vessel out that he just charged the pilot." And then Parsons thought, "Woohoo, this is my boon," because he immediately hired the pilot for $75 to bring him out and said, "Okay, if you bring us out across the bar, I will send a boat back in so you can get back into shore," which he does. And he goes on to say, "In passing over the bar, it was very dangerous, so much so that I would not attempt it again for a shipload of gold." So probably aged him greatly. He says, "When I came out, I came between the Cape and the North Breakers, had a Mr. Pierce on the top of the Cape with 2 towels, he holding up both to keep the rollers and one to keep to land. Thus I passed between the breakers, which I would not do again for any money." So not only did they have a pilot, they had some guy who was up on the top of the Cape with towels. It's like pointing in which direction they should steer the ship to just assist them. Who knows how useful it was, but they were doing everything they could to get across the bar. So Parsons goes on to write, "At 6 p.m. I passed the schooner Shark on shore, could not anchor, and we just got out ourselves, the markers being inside on and going out. But the Shark could have gone out with perfect ease had he not got bewildered, as I suppose he was, as there was much swell on at the time." So in his assessment, they should have made it. It was just a really heavy swell, but they didn't. So what happened to the Toulon and Mariposa? The Toulon went on. They actually departed on September 5th from Baker's Bay, and they set a speed record for getting to Honolulu. They made it in 14 days, arriving on September 19th, and their cargo was lumber, flour, and other goods. And so they turned it around really quick, though, because they needed to get back to the Columbia River. So on October 3rd, they set sail again. 21 days later, they arrived in Oregon. And it was a momentous arrival because they brought news for the first time that the Oregon boundary settlement had finally been finalized. And so that was big news. There's also good news for the Shark because as we'll see, the Toulon aided in them being able to get from Astoria down to San Francisco. So the Mariposa, they got out on the 11th. They waited and basically dropped anchor and then sent a boat in on the morning of the 11th to see if there were any survivors of the Shark. And they couldn't find anybody. They saw the Shark and it was stuck on the South Breakers and was getting broken apart. But they couldn't find any of the crewed officers who had already gone inland by that point. But they sent runners out saying, if you can find any of them and they want to come on the Mariposa with us to Honolulu, we will take them. And we know from the Polynesian newspaper that they claimed that their cargo was lumber, flour, and the etc. Now, the etc. is a big question mark. There was something else on that ship that they should have mentioned in this docket, but they didn't until later, as we'll see. So Howison is there with his crew and officers, and they're stranded in Astoria. And they made contact with Celine Woodworth, who's still there because he got stranded too. And Celine Woodworth basically said, yeah, I'm really sorry your ship got wrecked, but let's make the best of this. Why don't you join me? We're a big enough party to basically go down to San Francisco through Southern Oregon and Northern California. But Lieutenant Howison said, no, I really want to sail down. It'll be faster and safer, supposedly. But he has to wait until October 15th when there's a Hudson Bay Company bark, the Cadborough, who they finally agreed for 500 pounds sterling, we will transport you down to San Francisco. And they do eventually on January 18th. So they're there for several months. And there was a painting that depicts the Cadborough right off of Cape Disappointment. And you have to bear in mind, the Shark was 86 feet long, 24 foot 7 wide, with the officers and crew of 70 people. Now, the Cadborough was only 56 feet long and 17 feet wide. That's much smaller. And you're putting 70 plus their crew of 35, 105 people on this little schooner. Well, they ended up hiring the Toulon to actually transport some of the crew and officers of the Shark in the end. But they arrived finally on January 27th in San Francisco. And there's some U.S. naval ships there, including USS Savannah. And it was shortly after their arrival that news of the Donner Party has arrived in San Francisco in dire conditions, and they need to basically organize a rescue party. And so they organized a town hall meeting, and everybody's donating goods and money. And they need somebody to basically head up this, what became known as the Second Relief. So they were looking for volunteers. Whose arm goes up? Celine Woodworth. I, as the naval officer right now, I'm not attached to any particular ship, but I will volunteer for this, turned out to be a suicide mission, to go up and rescue the Donner Party. Yeah. And there's lots written about it. Unfortunately for Celine, it's not all favorable to him. At least that's what was written. In these many accounts, because they're relying on other people's versions of what happened to the Donner Party. But they neglected to realize that Celine had kept his own diary during that entire period. And it was never like quoted or listed in the bibliography of any of these other accounts. I came across it by accident because I was researching Celine, and it happened to be at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. It's 13 pages of handwritten journal entries. And it describes exactly what happened during the rescue of the Donner Party. And it's a bit different than the versions that you read about. But that's another research project. And so back to what happened to our other main character, Lieutenant Neil M. Howison. So he boards the Savannah, because it was one of the larger naval ships that was in port, and they sailed from San Francisco down to Monterey. Because Monterey was really the seat of the California government at that time. And it's when they were down there, shortly after their arrival, a new Commodore arrives, James Biddle, and he's just arriving from an assignment in China. But he's the ranking officer, so he's in charge. And being the Navy, they have to have a port of inquiry. Basically, hold some to account. We've lost one of our ships. Our schooner, the Shark, has been wrecked, and so they had what was called a port of inquiry, where they got testimony probably from all the officers about what happened. And in the end, they says, the inquiry would, as it has, result in entirely exonerating you from any blame whatever. So they realized that crossing the bar, everybody knew, was a very challenging naval feat. And to wreck on the bar, the US Peacock had already wrecked and other ships had wrecked. So they didn't hold Howison to blame, fortunately for him. But it's like he wasn't going to get another assignment right away. So he stays on the USS Savannah and sails with them down to San Diego, Panama. He gets off in Panama, crosses overland because he's going back to Washington, D.C. to write up his report about what he observed in Oregon. And so from Panama, he takes what were called packet ships, were basically merchant ships that had contracts to deliver the mail. He gets to Havana and he transfers to the packet ship Norma, and he eventually makes it to New York City on July 11th, 1847. And he goes to work writing this really long report. And he's gone to Washington, D.C. in early February. He contracts pneumonia. He's got a heart condition. And then on February 23rd, 1848, he drops dead. 6 days later, his report gets published. But that's unfortunately the end of a really distinguished naval officer. So two of the things that came out of the wrecking of the USS Peacock and the USS Shark and other ships were the acknowledgement there was a real need for skilled foreign river pilots and that they needed to do it by taking political actions. They listed in the newspapers, the Oregonian, that many ships, commercial ships, have been coming in and out of the Columbia River successfully and some not so successfully. There were several that were listed that were lost on the bar. And so the governor, Abernathy at the time, he establishes a board of commissioners to license pilots because they knew that not everybody who said they were a pilot were really a pilot. You know, there was a lot of money. I mean, $75 or $100 was the typical pilot fee. So it was big money back then. And they also knew that they had a problem with desertion. A lot of sailors that got across the bar is like, I'm never doing that again. And so when they got, and including the Shark lost at least 10 of their crew members who deserted when after they had gotten across the bar. And there was a pilot law that was passed in 1846. So just to recap, the cast of characters: Lieutenant Allison, past midshipman Woodward, USS Shark, the Carronade, and this last one I haven't talked about yet. The bear, the grizzly bear. So, well, how does a grizzly bear fit into this story? Okay, it goes from Oregon to Honolulu, Hawaii. That was like back and forth. Ships were going. This is what the harbor looked like back then. There's another article in the Polynesian in 1846 that says grizzly bear. The Mariposas brought here one of these formidable animals taken into Columbia. It was a cow of 3 months old with a growl like small thunder and teeth and claws that beat those of Little Red Riding Hood's wolf all hollow. It is now chained underneath the veranda of the U.S. Naval Command. We don't know why Captain Parsons decided to take a grizzly bear to Hawaii, but he did. And we can say probably with some certainty the first grizzly bear crossed the Columbia River in a ship, and also the first grizzly bear to arrive in Hawaii. And we can only speculate what happened to the bear, because I couldn't find any follow-up articles, but I like to think he was doing that new environment and he had a good life. So thanks very much for your attention. If there's any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them for you. Yes, sir.
Kind of obscure and just a minor part of the plot, but Centralia, Washington was founded by a black man named George Washington.
Oh,
Yeah. And I don't know if there'd be any connection. George Washington might not have been an uncommon name necessarily, but I'm wondering if there would be, he donated the land for the city.
oh, well, this fellow that I found his name, he was actually black or colored,
Right.
they called back then, so it could be the same gentleman.
I can check the dates. That was 1846.
Yep.
I can check the dates on that maybe. It's just an interesting semi-local connection.
Yeah, you find all sorts of rabbit holes that,
Yeah.
like, do I go down that one or wait for somebody else to do it? That's,
What's a grampus? Is that some kind of animal or what is that?
it's a whale. It's a whale, it's a type of whale. I had to look that up myself because it's like alligator? Yeah. Yeah. Shark. But it was a whale.
I'm not familiar with the area, so when you refer to the bar, you're talking about a sandbar?
That's it's the entrance beyond, right outside the Columbia River. They call it the bar. It's where the river meets the ocean essentially. And so you have
Okay.
all the water coming down from the river. And they say it's like a hammer and anvil out there, because you have one side pounding against the other, especially if the tide's coming in and you have the river
Right.
going out, and it just creates all sorts of complicated conditions for ships, especially if you're a ship that's relying strictly on your sails and the skill of your captain to navigate through these waters. And I mean, the bar is kind of oftentimes called the graveyard of the Pacific
Okay.
for just
Got
us.
it.
I was just gonna say, if you're interested in it, the Maritime Museum in Astoria is absolutely explicit.
Oh.
And it has all of the ships that have gone there, they have footage of Coast Guard vessels rescuing. And it's a beautiful maritime museum.
But
Okay.
the least important thing that anybody's gonna say here this afternoon. When you were saying about them having to depend on something in the lead. It seems to me probably it was a lead line, a lead weight with a
Oh, yeah.
thing for sounding.
Yeah, but they're doing soundings to determine how deep the water was.
Yeah, so I think it was probably depending on the lead.
Yeah, and so it's like they would go and they would measure how deep it was and
Yeah.
continue on, and that's on those maps, especially the Wilkes map, and then it was redone in 1851 by a new set of surveyors. They different points, but it was just like they would go every couple feet and do a sounding because they realized that the river bottom was constantly changing. So it was a snapshot in time. But
So I got the impression that this letter that was found later contained information that was kind of changed the narrative about who was at fault. Was it just that the pilot said I was afraid, or what was the deal?
What happened was, so all three ships, the Mariposa, the Toulon, and the Shark, made it down from Port Vancouver to Astoria. And then the Toulon was Captain Nathaniel Crosby, the most experienced, just shot out. He's gone on September 5th. The other two waited, and so then they sailed from Astoria to Baker's Bay, which was the typical route that ships would take for entering and exiting the Columbia River. And so between Astoria and Baker's Bay, Lieutenant Howison and Shark hired a river pilot, and it was Alexander Latty, the same guy who had brought them from when they were stuck on the shoal to Astoria. And so they made that safely. And then Howison was like, well, we made it this far. I think I can take it from here. And Parsons, on the other hand, was a little more cautious, and he just thought, well, if you aren't gonna have a pilot, I'll take the pilot. And so he hired him for $75 and he got out. And it was really the pilot knew kind of like, because Parsons even admitted, he said, I was so scared, I just wanted to drop the anchor and like wait and see if things improved. But the pilot said, no, we are not gonna drop the anchor. We're just like continuing on. And so they got out safely. Now, if Howison had kept Latty as his pilot and sailed out, we'll never know for certain. But he would have had an experienced pilot guiding him across the bar and out in the Pacific, and it could have been the Mariposa who got wrecked.
In those days, did they time their entry and exit with the tide?
They tried, but it was like they were looking at the tides and then they were looking at the winds, which were constantly changing, and then the weather conditions. And it wasn't, I think, terribly scientific, but it was experience. And so that's, I mean, it's a good point because it's like, okay, so they arranged with the Cadborough. It's like back in October 15th. It's like, okay, they'll take us out. But the Cadborough's captain, went down to Baker's Bay in November. And then they sat there and anchored until mid-January. The captain said, no, it's not ready. It's not ready. And finally, after 2 months of like sitting there, it's like winter's coming on, it's freezing. We're all crammed on this 56-foot little schooner. And then it's like, okay, let's go. And so then they went out. And so it was really kind of a judgment call. And you had to defer to the captain or the pilot.
Yeah.
Have you researched other shipwrecks?
No, this is this one, and it was like this one I was researching saline slides and then I learned about shark and it was just like, it seemed like there was more to the story than what I had read. So it's just like, every now and then I'd go back to it and then find some new information. It's like, this adds to the story. And I think the last thing I found was this grizzly bear piece. And it's like, what were they thinking of? And if the crew on the Shark knew that there was a grizzly bear on this small schooner, would they have taken him up on his offer? Yeah, how about us? On this whole schooner for 26 days with the bear.
Yeah.
Who got to feed the bear? And what did they feed him?
Yeah.
Who was fed to the? Who?
Yeah.
It's like, did they do a head count before?
The legislation that you referenced, what was the content?
I didn't read it. I just came across it and I thought it was very interesting. It's like finally they were motivated after I think the wreck of the Shark, since it was a US government ship, to say that, and they realized that a lot of people who stepped forward and said, oh, I can be your pilot, we're not fully qualified perhaps. And it's like, no, we're at a point where there's enough maritime traffic coming in and they really wanted to attract trade. So there was a big series of letters that went back and forth because Parsons created the impression that it was just really dangerous and unsafe to cross the bar and into the Columbia River and you shouldn't go there. Whereas people in Oregon were like, no, it's, you just have to have an experienced pilot. And then it's completely safe. And they wanted to really establish trade and commerce. And so there are different factions. Question?
You gotta publish this in a paper someplace so other people will be able to
Yeah,
know about
eventually it's on the list of things to do. It's just, those things take time. It's like, I've kind of, with other topics that I've researched that usually put together how, for me, my process goes gathering the information, organizing it, and then putting together a PowerPoint to make it into a kind of an interesting story, but also one that's, I hope is well researched and factual, because I really have come across other kind of historic research and you realize that they just didn't have access to as much information as we do now via the internet. There's so much more out there, but you just have to have the patience to sift through it. And then when you come across something, it's like, oh, I recognize how that fits in the story. So yeah, eventually I will write about it. Yes, sir.
How successful was the Shark and the other four ships that built at the same time in interdicting the slave trade?
Very. I think they were very fast and they were armed, usually 12 cannons was their standard kind of like armament. But any ship they wanted to stop, they could. And since they had a shallow draft, they could go into some fairly shallow waters and pursue these slaving ships if they tried to make a run for it. And so they were effective. And unfortunately, the Shark was kind of the last one, last of the five that survived, and then it wrecked in 1846. The others, three had wrecked. One was told as being kind of unsound and unfit. And then the Grampus was taken out of commission for whatever reason. I mean, eventually ships become obsolete. They have newer, bigger, better ship. But the Shark was the last of that group of 5 schooners. And so, and it had a really amazing career.
Well, there's another interesting little tidbit about the Shark, and it's sort of sailing along the west coast of Africa in the slave trade. One of its first missions was to take some emissaries from the US government and other people in the United States that were interested in sending Black people back to Africa.
Yes.
And they were actually the initial ones that landed where Liberia is now, and they met with local people and started working on the groundwork for that.
Yes, that's another really fascinating part of the Shark's history. And so the Shark had this amazing kind of life as a schooner in the US Navy and participated in some really significant events, including that one. Yes, sir.
Well, following along the line of what Neymar was saying, when they did interdict a slave ship, did they force them to take the slaves back to where they got them, or what did they do?
Based on what I read, they did take the slaves back, not necessarily to their home villages or home countries, but they took them back to land. And so that was part of what they could do. I mean, other ships, they would be considered prize ships, especially if they had a cargo that was worth any value, and then there's the value of the ship. And back then it was kind of like, well, if you capture a ship because you're outgunned them, you basically own the ship, and then you take it to a port where they had courts that would be, they call prize courts, and they would kind of evaluate what this ship and cargo are worth, and then they would they would sell it off basically, and then the officers and crew would get a share of the prize money, they called it. But I don't think they didn't sell the slaves back to anybody on land. They basically took them back to land, but I don't know beyond, once they got there, what happened to them.
Walk home from here.
Yeah.
If you can figure out what direction it is.
Where did the shark go in the Mediterranean and what was its purpose there?
No, I don't know. I just
Okay.
was going through, and it's like when you're sifting through newspaper.com articles and just seeing the articles that have written about it. But I think when it was sailing off the coast of North Africa, it was suppression of piracy, because that was a real problem back then. So I have to imagine that it
So,
was,
yeah, that's what it was doing in the Mediterranean.
it's just that there was enough American trade and that and pirates out there who was like, oh, if there's an American merchant ship or a whaler, who basically chase it down, shoot a cannonball over its bow, and they would stop. And so then that was when they were captured. Any question?
I was just curious, I just finished the book on the Francis Lake, and I was just wondering how many hours you think you had in this, in the research.
You know, I've never added it all up. I mean, I retired about 5 years ago and started kind of researching all this kind of like longer story that ties back to a historic building in San Francisco called the US Mint. And it's the old San Francisco Mint at the corner of Fifth and Mission. And the reason I got introduced to Celine Woodworth was after he had his first naval career and retired, got married, started having kids, Civil War came along. And even though his wife was probably really not in favor, he re-enlisted in the Navy. And he was assigned to command several gunships up and down the Mississippi River. And after a couple of years of doing that and engaged in some really horrendous battles, it's like, I want to go back to San Francisco, and my wife's missing me. And so he started negotiating. And so he was basically promised by the US Navy, okay, we're getting a new ship to send out to San Francisco. It was right during the early years of the Civil War, and after the epic battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack that we probably all heard about a bit in high school history class. But after that epic battle, both sides realized the era of timber-hulled ships is over. Every timber-hulled ship in the US Navy that they sent against the Merrimack was destroyed pretty much. And so on the Union side, they commissioned 10 new monitors. They were the second generation monitors. Out of that 10, there were a group of businessmen from San Francisco back in Washington said, we want one of those. And so they fabricated it's called the USS Comanche in a shipyard in New York. And they basically assembled it and then shipped it to San Francisco in the cargo hold of the clipper ship, and it arrived. But they promised Celine, as soon as we get this Comanche, this new ironclad monitor, state-of-the-art ship completed, you're going to be the first commander. So just sit tight on your gunship in the Mississippi. It didn't happen in the end, but eventually Celine got to come back to San Francisco. What's interesting about Celine, after the Donner Party, they signed him to a ship called the Bark Anita, and it was a supply ship and a troop transport ship. And so he sailed up and down the coast of California and Oregon and came back into the Columbia River several times, crossing the bar. So unlike the officers and the crew of the Shark, he had to do it many times. Great. Well, good.
Yeah.